Well, I want to say thank you to everybody for joining us. If you can mute your line, drop us a line in the chat if you want. Introduce yourself, let everybody know who you are. We have a lot of ground to cover today. I'm very excited to be joining you. My name is Kemp Edmonds. I'm the Managing Director of the Canadian Workplace Culture Index, and we're going to get down to business. Again, if you have any questions at any point throughout the entire presentation today, please drop them into the chat. Indeed, our lead researcher, Taylor Wright, is excited to address any and all questions. Thank you so much for joining us, Taylor. I'll introduce you in a moment. We want to say welcome and thank you for joining us today as we explore the 2022 Canadian Workplace Culture Report to provide a window into the state of workplace culture in Canada. Of course, we'll continue admitting everybody that is in the waiting room. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Thanks to this lovely lands and that we work and play from. Next, I wanted to say thank you to our strategic partners for the continued support of our work. Thank you to Equitable Life of Canada, Homewood Health, TraceSafe, and the Reframe Group. Today, we wanted to take a moment and ask Jack Wong of the Reframe Group to tell us a little bit about the services and solutions that his team at the Reframe Group develop for their customers. Jack, you want to share a little bit about the Reframe Group and your work there?
Yeah, hey everybody. So many of you are probably already familiar that we specialize in employee benefits and retirement, in addition to financial planning and estate planning. So as a globally award-winning Best for the World B Corporation, we also have a very strong commercial insurance practice. Some of the services we specialize in are directors and officers liability or management liability, professional liability, cyber insurance, commercial insurance for your property and other assets, and a whole lot more than that to help you and your company thrive today and protect tomorrow. Thanks, Cam.
Thank you very much, Jack. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. I've already introduced myself. I want to introduce Antonio. Antonio is the CEO and founder of the Canadian Workplace Culture Index and of the Reframe Group. Thank you so much for joining us, Antonio. We're also today joined by Taylor Wright. Taylor Wright is a PhD chemist and researcher from the University of British Columbia. In addition to his work for UBC's Centre for Teaching, Learning and Technologies, Equity and Inclusion Scholars Project, which aims to develop tools to assess demographic inequities within learning across first-year science education courses. Taylor now works for Lululemon in raw materials innovation, thanks to his incredible thesis on specially designed fabrics for managing bacteria. Taylor, tell us more, because I can't do justice to your work.
So it's a broad swath of things, but what really got me interested in this project and invested in here is looking at inequities. So I looked at inequities across education, making sure that all students are accessing education in similar ways, having opportunities to excel and to grow. And that translates perfectly over to making sure that all people in a workplace are feeling safe, happy, feeling heard, and having opportunities to both excel and to pursue and grow their own careers. So it fits in naturally here, and I'm excited to dive into the numbers and the statistics we've collected.
Great, thank you very much, Taylor. So today's little agenda, we're going to start by discussing the methodology and sharing where the data comes from. And then we'll dive right into our Canadian Workplace Culture scores across different demographics. We'll take a little bit of a look at self-employment along with some key insights that we saw on specific questions. We'll talk about the impacts of workplace culture of COVID among different groups, flexibility in the workplace. We'll talk about justice in an Indigenous context in Canada. And then we'll talk about some key takeaways that we observed from the data. Before we do all that, let's get started and tell you a little bit about how we did this. In February of 2022, the Canadian Workplace Culture Index set out to update and reestablish our index and benchmark of Canadian workplace culture, previously established in May of 2021. We worked with researchers at the University of British Columbia, in addition to Taylor. Thank you, Taylor, for being our lead on the project, to collect Canadians' opinions, more than 2,000, about workplace culture, and to create indices for workplace culture nationally, regionally, for each province and across industries. This was done using an organic sampling method built on a new delivery framework called random device engagement, where we delivered a modern conversational chat survey to collect responses to a random set of devices that already had demographic information on them. This resulted, the results were weighted independently to establish an overall index and our 6 unique index workplace attribute scores. The report lays out select insights and results drawn from the research. This report does not represent the entirety of the data available. Read more of the details on methodology, collection methods, and representation at the end of this report. Please contact us for more information as well. Let's dive right in. I want to start off by talking about the Canadian workplace culture scores across different demographics. We're going to drive straight into this, looking first at provinces, then at ethnicities, age, and education. The the 6 scores that you're going to see today represent how employees feel about their workplace. This is not a reflection of the way companies feel or the way companies report on any of these metrics. So to start off, I wanted to share what different provinces look like. And what we saw was that coasts scored the highest, while Ontario and Quebec scored the lowest. For those curious, JEDI stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. We saw that respondents from BC, Alberta, and the Maritimes reported much more positive workplace culture scores than their counterparts in Ontario and Quebec. This is going to be a bit of a theme as we go through the data today. Taylor, did you have anything to add here as we look at the overall province scores?
Yeah, I'll just highlight what you said there, Kemp, that it's a theme throughout today that we're seeing that Ontario and Quebec are scoring lower across these metrics. We're going to see that repeated throughout when we break down question by question. And it was just a consistent thing we noticed that as we get closer to the coast, we're seeing higher and lower as we get closer to Ontario and Quebec. I think we can look at that through a lot of different lenses, but it does highlight this sort of persistent problem that we're seeing.
Great. We have a question here. What happened to the prairies? After pulling this data together, we did have data from Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Indeed, what we saw was that the data was rather similar or fell in the middle. Taylor, do you have anything to add on the prairies?
No, it was quite similar. It's just a bit easier to represent it like this. And I think the full report will have more of that data as well.
Exactly. Thank you. Great question. So next we looked at how different ethnicities experienced workplace culture, and we saw reporting consistently low scores from Black Canadians who experienced the least positive workplace culture, while Asian Canadians reported the most positive workplace culture experience. Of course, white Canadians, as you can see, reported more positive experiences in the workplace than Black Canadians, but certainly less positive than Asian Canadians. Taylor, anything to add here?
Yeah, just sort of preempting and highlighting that whenever we talk about demographics such as this, when we break that data down, that we do need to think of it in more sort of a deficit model. So this isn't sort of a failing with the people who are responding, but it might highlight inequities within a workplace that is depressing the way these people respond and look at these questions. So it's not an issue with that grouping of people, but more perhaps a systemic problem that is holding them back a little bit.
Two great questions here. One is, where do Latin Canadians fit in? Taylor, can you speak to a little bit about representative sampling and how that works and what that means to Latin Canadian populations and Indigenous populations?
Yep. So the sampling metric or the sampling system we used allow us to set sort of buckets to make sure that we got a representative sample across Canadians. So we looked at Canadian census data and tried to make sure that within the group that we sampled, we had equal percentages for all of those. Now, the downside with that is that for very small percentage groups within Canada, it's very hard within that to get enough people to make statistically significant samplings. So we did have some responses from some of those people, but it's just not fair to represent their responses here on these bar graphs if we don't have enough of them to make it statistically representative within that grouping.
Thank you, Taylor. And that's important to note that the volume that was required to create a representative sample meant that we saw a lack of statistically significant responses. I think in the future, what this means for us is a desire to acquire more data so that we can actually properly represent smaller ethnic groups within the Canadian population. A very good question, very good points from the chat. Thank you. So we also looked at age, and we found that age really strongly factors into Canadians' likelihood to report a positive workplace culture experience. Generally what we saw is those who were older reported having more positive workplace culture experiences than their younger counterparts. The differences in scores between ages is not as significant as seen in the differences between ethnic or provincial groups. Taylor, can you speak a little bit to what those gaps mean when we see a bigger gap among provincial reporting demographic versus these smaller gaps among different age groups?
Yeah, so it's important to remember that each person, we had many different metrics for them here. So we're taking the same people and we're putting them into these different types of buckets and looking at how that affects the scores that we represent here. So we see much bigger differences across provinces. So that lets us know that that is a much bigger indicator of having a less equitable or less fair or less beneficial workplace culture. So here we see that age does seem to have an effect, but it's much smaller of one. And so by breaking it down by age for this, and we'll go through some age metrics later, it's not as big of an indicator. So age does have a small effect, but not nearly as significant as some of the other types of breakdowns we can do, taking those same people and putting them into different sorts of buckets.
Great, thank you, Taylor. And now we're going to move to one of our most conclusive metrics here as we look at education. Education was the most direct predictor of an individual's likelihood to report a positive workplace culture across all metrics. You can see here that it is very linear as well. No other attribute was more likely to predict a positive workplace culture experience. I think our researchers were a bit surprised by how much education level determined a positive workplace culture experience. I want to pass it to Antonio. Antonio has a lot of insight here around education and how that impacts people's enjoyment in a positive workplace.
I think just the access to additional opportunities for individuals who might be of higher socioeconomic status because they might be making more money than someone who doesn't have as much opportunity in a low socioeconomic class, or correlated with their lower level of education and tougher time in lower level jobs.
So Taylor, this is a really interesting one. You're a researcher from an educational institution. This was clearly a linear relationship. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts here. What did you expect to see? Was this surprising?
I think this is a good one to highlight how something like your education level might influence the type of person that's responding to that question. To get a postgraduate degree, it means you're probably close to about 30 plus. It puts you into certain buckets when we talked about socioeconomic status. And so it's more maybe defining, in this case, the type of person who's responding. It could be anything from age to potentially location. Maybe those types of jobs are located more in certain provinces than others. And so this is a type of example that might dictate a lot about the type of person, perhaps more than the workplace as well.
Thank you. We move on to look at men and women. Men and women reported very similar workplace culture scores with a lack of statistically significant differences. And I think that really speaks to, I think some of the parity that happens in terms of workplace culture experience. Antonio, do you have any insights here into how men and women seem to have very similar experiences?
I think because we had such a large sample, this data just holds true. There was nothing that we found that was alarming between the men and women differences this year. And I know that's not the most exciting insight right now, but Taylor, do you have anything else to comment here?
Just to highlight again that it was consistent that we didn't see big differences. So this is a broad average, and taken as a broad average with these metrics, we're not seeing those big differences here, which is ideal. In an ideal case, we would see no differences across all of our breakdowns. Ideally, everyone is experiencing equal workplace culture, equal opportunities in the workplace. And so I think this highlights, at least in these metrics and the way people respond to these questions, we're not detecting any big deficiencies here, which is ideal.
Thank you very much. Great point in here in the questions here from Sarah, that those that are more highly educated are more likely to have the employer perspective, and that they help determine the culture. So they may think more highly of it than those that work below them. So that's a very interesting point. A question for you, Taylor, here. What was the N for the survey?
Yep. So we had 2,000 respondents who fully completed the survey. And as others have pointed out, for groups that we maybe didn't have enough to represent fully, we do have the opportunity to go back and recollect with the same questionnaire set additional data. So someone asked if we'd collected information on people experiencing ongoing disabilities. That wasn't something we collected, but we do have the opportunity to go back, collect that, and then factor directly into these analyses in the same way.
Yeah, really another comment here from Dave McDonald. Interesting to have the trans and non-binary perspectives factored in here. So we do have intention to go back to our research source to create more defined groups. And it sounds like disabilities and non-binary gender are really key ones there. So we're going to take note of that and look forward to pursuing that as a potential audience to dig deeper into the data. So we're going to dive into some key themes for the year, flexibility being one, Indigenous recognition and education, and finally COVID. Before we do that, let's take a look at a few key insights around age and loyalty and how Canadians' likelihood to recommend their employers has changed from our previous research. Someone has asked what JEDI is. JEDI is a new acronym, stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. In the past, this was known as DNI, or Diversity and Inclusion. It's also been called DEI or EDI, and continues to transform and grow in terms of the scope of how we create equity among individuals in the workplace and beyond. We wanted to start off with a single question, which speaks to one of the themes that we saw throughout the research, with respondents from Quebec and Ontario reporting significantly lower scores and experience across all measures of workplace culture, flexibility, and COVID impacts. Antonio, do you want to start off here? Give us a little color and some of your thoughts here as we look at the differences here.
I think, as many of you know, COVID has impacted a lot of businesses, and arguably Ontario and Quebec have had some of the most stringent lockdowns, and they haven't had the luxury that some of the other provinces have had, where there have been open up for business and closed. There's just been permanent lockdown for the majority of time there. And I know a number of business owners who've actually left the province and have been conducting business outside of Ontario and Quebec, just because the situation's been so grim. So I feel like that just seems to have been evident in the data that we've gathered.
Taylor, anything to add here?
Yeah, just that I really like this question. It's such a simple question. And I think it's a bit striking, the result. And it's great that, upwards of almost 80% of people in BC, Alberta, the Maritimes say they like their job. That's perfect. We want that to be as high as possible. But it's such a striking difference that about 20% lower, about 60% say that they don't, or say that they do like their job in Ontario and Quebec. So there's about a 40% of people saying that they don't really like their job. So there's certainly a lot of room to improve across all of Canada, but particularly some issues in Ontario and Quebec that we'll go into in more detail.
Yeah, great question here from Sarah around, that gap. Does that also reflect a younger population and a higher minority population, lower educational level? I think, really speaks a little bit to the representative sample that was created. Taylor, do you want to speak a little bit to that? I think we are going to explore it with some other insights as we go deeper into the results. But do you have anything to share on that?
Yep. So generally speaking, because of the random sampling method that we used, it does capture pretty equal demographics with respect to age and things like that in the different provinces. So we don't see that age is splitting up. So we're not just seeing, for example, all the young people that responded to the survey being Ontario and Quebec. As we go through some of these other examples, I think it'll highlight how even when we do break it down by different age groups, we do and don't see these same trends repeated. So in this case, we can really highlight this being a provincial difference here. And as we see some other breakdowns, we won't see necessarily the same trends.
Thank you very much. And just so everyone knows, the quotas we had were around age, province, and ethnicity. Is that correct, Taylor? Great, thank you. Awesome. So one of the things that we also saw was that a higher education level leads to better values alignment. The question here was an agreement with the statement, my values align with those of my organization. This really speaks to something that was shared earlier. Those that have, potentially a higher level of education might have more influence on the culture and therefore potentially more control over it. Antonio, what are your thoughts here on how values alignment correlates to education level?
I'm struggling with this one. I agree with you. I think, there may be postgraduate and just income levels, and you're going to be more satisfied with your job in some of the major centers potentially.
Taylor, what are your thoughts here? You as a postgraduate with a PhD, working for maybe a more traditional company than some of your colleagues.
Yeah, I think that's, you definitely hit the nail on the head there. It's about potentially having opportunities. Postgraduates often have the opportunity to move far distances to find a job that really aligns with them. It opens up opportunities all over the world, particularly. Potentially with someone with a high school degree, it's a bit harder to get a visa. It's a bit harder to move around necessarily, to have a company maybe move you out there to find something that really aligns with you. So this just highlights that people who fit into these different buckets have different opportunities open and available to them. And again, we'd like to see everyone be as close to 100% as possible. Everyone should feel like their values align with the organization they work at. So it just highlights that there's still some deficits there and some room for growth.
So we move on to looking at Canadians likely to recommend. This is one of the statistics that we carry over year. We want to kind of look at that. I think one of the interesting things here is the difference between last year and this year, particularly in Ontario. We're down across the board except in Alberta, but particularly in Ontario, that's a big difference in terms of how many people were willing to say they recommend their employer when we talked to them in May of last year versus February of this year. Anything to add here, Taylor? What are your thoughts?
I think, again, it highlights the consistent issue with Ontario and Quebec scoring a bit lower. And the overall Canadian average there going down, I think, as Antonio brought up, could potentially be due to things like COVID. So this is 2021, so it was during the COVID pandemic, but certainly things have been drawn out more. Some of that government subsidy money that was maybe keeping businesses afloat started to run out as we entered into 2022. And so we may be picking up on some of those trends. So it'll be an exciting one to look at as we go forward, as we hopefully come out of the pandemic. Hopefully we see that number begin to go back up.
So we have I think it's a question here. The results contradict what other organizations like Gallup have conducted. All I can tell you about, what our data says is that it represents the 2,000 plus Canadians that responded to the survey. Most industries experience difficulty acquiring and retaining employees. Could you please comment on that? So we didn't survey organizations about their needs in any way, really. We asked employees to tell us about what workplace culture in Canada is like for them. So it is a good thing to wonder about different industries experiencing difficulties acquiring and retaining employees. But that wasn't the focus of our research. More the focus was to have employees tell us about what workplace culture looks like for them. Great point there, Sarah. Thanks for sharing. So this was something that was kind of went against what we sort of expected, which was we expected younger Canadians to be more likely to leave for a raise. So this question asked people to agree with the statement, I would leave my organization for a 5% raise to do the same job at another organization. And what we saw was kind of surprising is that older Canadians responded and told us that they were most likely to leave for financial purposes, leading us to believe that they may be most motivated by income. Taylor, anything to add here?
Again, I think this might highlight sort of differences within the people who are responding to this. So if you're 55 plus, you may have more financial demands. And so that extra 5% raise may be more than enough to get you to jump. That money might be able to put to greater use in your case. Maybe you have a family to support, you're more likely to have children, or perhaps some kind of illness, or even parents to support as they move into their old age. 18 to 24s, maybe that raise isn't what's causing them to move, as we'll see in some later examples. Maybe there's other drivers. So this isn't, as was brought up before, so for the Great Recession, this isn't collecting information on how likely are you just to leave your job. It's specific to this question. It's specific to for a 5% raise. And so there's other questions we can ask about how likely are you to stay at your company, and we'll see that later. But this is very specifically for a 5% raise, would you jump ship?
Thank you very much. And I think people who are older may also have the opportunity to make bigger career moves, while younger Canadians may not envision or may not even have that kind of opportunity. Also a great comment here from the chat. Maybe younger employees are facing a lower income and financial outlook and are more concerned with culture and values. And that does speak to some other things that we saw as we go forward, and we'll discuss as we move forward around values and how younger Canadians act and behave. So this question asked if individuals saw themselves at their organizations in 3 years. It was really interesting for us to see that, the highest likelihood of people sticking around were those between 35 and 44, while Canadians under 24 rather expectedly were the least likely to see themselves at their organizations in 3 years. I think, surprising to us was that older Canadians in the 45 to 54 bracket who are not yet at retirement age are less likely to see themselves at their organizations than their slightly younger counterparts. This may speak to the great shift or the great resignation as well. Taylor, thoughts here?
So I think this highlights what some people in the chat were saying. So we saw that younger Canadians were less likely to say they would jump jobs for a pay increase, but they're also saying that they don't see themselves at the same organization. And so I think that highlights this idea that they may be moving for different reasons. So it could be everything from, they're finishing up school and they intend to move organization, move across the country. Maybe they're trying to get into a career that they're not into, or a career path or an industry they're not into right now, or they're moving to make sure that their values align with the organization they want to be in. So those two questions taken together kind of highlight the fact that just for the groups that we sampled, money was not the prime motivator for these younger people to move to a different organization, whereas it was a bit more of a motivator for the older age groups we looked at.
Thank you, Taylor. I think I did want to highlight something Sarah shared here in the chat that we also discussed, which is that, you know, a 5% raise for an older individual who is likely to have a higher income is a much bigger jump than someone in a lower income position potentially. And then, yes, definitely 45 is not old at all. I couldn't agree more as somebody who is reaching that point very soon. I wanted to bring us to some key insights around self-employment. When we conducted our research this year, we wanted to hear from Canadians who were employed full-time, more than 20 hours per week. We included Canadians who reported those levels of employment, whether they declared that they were self-employed or not. The results about the levels of self-employment among different groups of Canadians were very interesting, revealing some interesting generational differences and some differences between Canadians based on ethnicity, and less revealing by education level. So in this case, this was sort of the most striking to us, was that Black Canadians reported being self-employed at rates of more than 5 times higher than their Asian Canadian counterparts and more than 2 times than white Canadians. Taylor, do you have some thoughts here? You know, this is really interesting. It might, you know, speak to how we view the term self-employment. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so in this case, self-employment could be everything from, you know, you're starting your own business, and we'll talk about a little bit age, I think, on the next slide, how that might impact the same thing. It could be a cultural difference. So maybe you grew up in a culture of entrepreneurship versus maybe you grew up wanting to, you know, based on your culture and your parentage, wanting to go into something like maybe medicine, where you want to work at a hospital. That's, you know, not as self-employed as easily done. So self-employed here can mean a lot of different things. It can mean the gig economy, as we'll talk about in the next slide a little bit. So it just highlights that there's differences in the demographics of the people we collected information on. And that, of course, then impacts all of the questions we asked. And that's really what this is designed to do. But it does mean we have to take each data point with a little bit of a grain of salt and really think critically about what's being answered in each question.
We had a great question here from Philip that kind of relates back to our last thing. So in our 2020 report, we showed that 18 to 24-year-olds were far more likely to move for a 10% raise. You know, what's changed so drastically? I think, you know, 5% to 10% is rather significant. That was part of our intention, as we wanted to see if that would turn the dial and change things. And I think what we saw was that, you know, it kind of makes me think, you know, when there's a sale on something and it's, you know, 10% off, I'm like, that's just tax, you know, or 5%. That's not really something that's going to cause me to take action. And I think that's, to me, in my hypothesis, that's really what it says, is that, you know, 5% isn't enough, isn't significant enough for as many Canadians to take action. Taylor, thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, is that 5% is potentially a lot to uproot, you know, your stability and maybe your life for. And as we saw with that younger group not being as willing to uproot things for that 5%, it highlights that, as someone else brought up in the chat, that if you're older and you're making more money, that 5% might also be, like, on a net wise, much greater amount. So there's a lot of different things at play there. But yeah, 10% was maybe a bit too wide. So we wanted to narrow that in to see who would jump for about 5%.
Thank you very much, Taylor. I think, you know, that interesting, you know, the state of work and what work looks like for different Canadians is really something that's being spoken about here. You know, we look at this and we see that, you know, younger Canadians are twice as likely to be reporting that they're self-employed than the average Canadian. This might be, you know, the gig economy. There's lots of different things that can factor in here. Taylor, what are your thoughts here as we look to and think about historical data on self-employment?
It's another one that we're both interested in looking at as it changes over time, and one that we can think about from a lot of different angles. One way I like to think about this is technology and familiarity with digital services. So if you're self-employed, maybe you stream something on the internet, maybe you run an e-commerce type shop by yourself using a variety of services. You're more likely to be tech savvy and able to kind of take on those projects statistically if you're a bit younger, you grew up with this technology. And so we may see this shift over time. We might start seeing more self-employed people as these 18 to 24s age up. They may continue on with that entrepreneurial spirit, or we may see it decrease. Maybe it's reflecting things like the gig economy as well. So there's a lot at play here. And so it's one that we're definitely interested in keeping up and looking at as this evolves.
Thank you, Taylor. Antonio, you have something to add here, please?
Yeah, I think if you just, we work out of a co-working location and different co-working locations across Canada. And if you just look at the demographics of the co-working location, you see that they fit right into this. And a lot of them are web developers, marketing experts, and highly tech-focused roles. And I'd say about 50% of the membership are self-employed small business owners. And so that aligns well with the research that we found.
Yeah, I think the state is really speaks to the state of work and the changing and transforming nature of work, especially among younger populations, for sure. And then we look finally at education levels. Taylor, I'm going to pass this to you. I think this one we were a little less sort of surprised, although those with lower education levels report being self-employed more than 5 times the rate of the Canadians with the highest levels of education. Taylor, some thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this one is catching what people are saying in the chat and what we've been talking about here. It's a lot of factors. So if we think about postgraduate people, what comes to your head is maybe a doctor, a scientist. Those are people that were more likely to work for bigger organizations and less likely to report being self-employed. It also dictates maybe the types of people who went into a postgraduate degree. So maybe you grew up wanting to be, I'm going to keep saying doctor here, maybe you wanted to be a doctor, and so that's what pushed you towards that, and therefore you're now working where you wanted to work. And again, when we narrow down to things like a high school education, we may be catching people that are younger within that bucket as well. And as was talked about, it may catch people within the gig economy, or it may catch people that, because they didn't have a college or university degree, they decided to go on that entrepreneurial path. They decided to try to make their own way in their career. And so it's catching a lot of different people. So we need to be careful that how much we sort of ascribe differences to people here. So we're seeing these numbers, we're looking at these trends, but this is an important one to look at as it changes over time.
6 key takeaways for you today to walk away with. These were derived by our researchers and analysis team after poring over the data for hundreds of hours. And we've talked about them throughout today. Respondents from Quebec and Ontario reported significantly lower workplace culture experience across all attributes and questions. They also told us that they have the least flexibility and have been significantly more impacted by the negative impacts of COVID than any other region, particularly around job losses, where they were 3 times more likely than Canadians on average to have lost a job due to COVID. Racial inequities are seen across COVID impacts. Inequity continues to plague Canadians who are Black or BIPOC versus the average or the experience of white and Asian Canadians. Racial inequities were seen across our themes of COVID and flexibility, and were noted across education and income level as well. When it came to that, it was a bright spot to note such high positive scores from Asian Canadians, and although it's clear that we have a lot further to go for racial equity in Canada. Education was far and away the #1 factor that determined the likelihood for a Canadian to report that they had a positive workplace culture experience. Higher levels of education may result in more positive workplace culture experiences for a number of reasons, including how education impacts choices, the workplace culture of more highly educated workplace, and the nature of work for more highly educated individuals. If ever there was a message to share with my children and to the next generation, it's what our parents all told us as well, as the importance of education. It was interesting to see that older Canadians have loyalty challenges and are most likely to leave for a 5% raise, whereas those who are 18 to 24 were least likely to see themselves as their employer in 3 years. So, we see kind of different challenges for loyalty at different ends of the spectrum. It can be definitely noted that the nature of work and the place in their careers mean that younger Canadians would be less likely to stick around. But more importantly, I think there's an opportunity for employers who work with younger Canadians to step up their game, provide more paths to career growth, and to just open the doors and windows that there is a career growth opportunity within your organization. Over 30% of workplaces did not recognize any Indigenous Peoples Day. This was something that was pretty disappointing. Recognition doesn't mean everybody gets the day off. It doesn't mean that people don't work. Recognition is about making sure people know what the day is about and why it's there. Some organizations did lunch and learns. Some organizations had their whole team not work that day and learn about Indigenous peoples in Canada. So there's lots of different ways that recognition can be manifest, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a day off or a stat holiday. Some industries were twice as likely to provide employees with flexibility for health, family, and unexpected events. I think we put this in a kind of a bit of a shiny light. You know, for us, it's really disappointing that during COVID, some industries were half as likely to provide the same flexibility as others. You know, parity for flexibility should be something we strive for, especially during COVID. The impacts of not providing flexibility for sickness or medical needs have been seen across industries during COVID. It is a positive sign that we've seen new regulations requiring employers to provide sick days and provides a minimum standard that can raise workplace culture for all Canadians. Thank you so much for joining us. Have you considered asking in a future survey whether their workplaces are moving to a shorter work week, something like a 4-day work week? Sarah, that's a great question and definitely something that we'll look to ask in the future. It's been really interesting looking at justice this year. I think the 4-day work week is another big theme that we see, particularly around the flexibility conversation. And so that's a great question. We just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us, and thank you for all of your time. Really appreciate you being here with us. Almost everybody has stuck around to the end, and so we really appreciate it. We'll be sharing our resources afterwards, including a free version of our research report and some more in the next few days. Please be in touch if you have any questions. We really appreciate you sticking with us for the whole hour. Thank you to Antonio Jovanovic, our CEO and founder, for joining us. And Taylor Wright, it's been such a joy working with you on this. You've taught me so much and enlightened me in so many ways. I'm so grateful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.